Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Last night, Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell dropped his demand that new Senate rules guarantee the preservation of the filibuster. This doesn't mean that the filibuster has now been eliminated. There are Democrats that still support keeping it. It just means that there's no language in the rules of how the Senate will operate that guarantee it won't be eliminated at another time in the next couple of years. Now, such language has never actually been used in the rules to govern the Senate before. This objection from McConnell really mattered because without the implementation of the new rules, the Senate was operating with the previous rules from the previous session that didn't accommodate the reality of a 50-50 tie in the Senate. In fact, without the new rules, many Senate committees were still being chaired by Republicans, even while Democrat Chuck Schumer was the new Democratic Senate Majority Leader. Today, we're going to be in conversation about congressional rules and procedures that are not found in law nor in the Constitution, but that nonetheless play a big role in how lawmaking occurs or doesn't occur, how such rules have changed over time, and how we have seemingly moved into an era of what I'll call procedural warfare. For this conversation, I am very happy to welcome to this program somebody who has written a lot about these topics over the years. That is Stephen S. Smith. Stephen S. Smith is a professor of social sciences and professor of political science at Washington University. As I indicated, he has written a great deal over the years about these issues. His two latest books that he either wrote or co-wrote are called Politics Over Process, Partisan Conflict and Post-Passage Processes in the U.S. Congress, and the Senate Syndrome, the evolution of procedural warfare in the modern U.S. Senate. He joins us via Zoom. Stephen Smith, it is my good pleasure to welcome you to this program. Thank you for taking the time today to join us.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Mitch.
I suspect, even though we may have an agreement from Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer now for rules that will govern the Senate for the next few years at a minimum, that these issues that were keeping them from getting to an agreement are far from over. And we could probably anticipate seeing them continually pop up, even in these next couple of years of the next Congress.
That's right. The big issue here for the Senate, of course, is that there are 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats. The vice president makes the Democratic Party the technical majority party. And it puts them in a position to have the vice president break tie votes. So the Republicans worry that the Democrats will be able to ram things through the Senate with on a tie vote, with the vice president casting the tie-breaking vote over and over again. And so the Republicans anticipate using the filibuster, which generally requires 60 votes to overcome, as a way to slow things down or maybe even to block them altogether. They wanted an understanding that their ability to do that would not be undermined by a new precedent that the Democrats everyone might have anticipated will eventually seek to set. You might recall, Mitch, that in 2013, when the Democrats were in the majority, and in 2017, when the Republicans were in the majority, they did something called nuking the filibuster, the nuclear option. Now, what that meant was that rather than changing the rules through the usual means, they did it through a point of order backed by a simple majority and kind of forced it on the Senate. And neither side was really happy with that, at least at the time they were in the minority. And so that now applies to all nominations, executive branch nominations, and judicial nominations. The question has been whether that same kind of precedent would be extended to legislation. And the Republicans worried that the Democrats would do that lickety-split, and they were hoping that they get an agreement from the Democrats not to do that as a condition for organizing the Senate. The Democrats refused to commit to such a ban on nuking the filibuster, and so that slowed things down here. And it meant that, for the time being, it meant that Mitch McConnell was saying, I'm not going to allow the Senate to organize. until you agree to this. Well, as you were saying, he relented last night.
Could Mitch McConnell have just continued to object and have never allowed for a regular procedure to occur in the Senate? And this is something I asked that I think would have been unseeable just a decade or two ago. But now I don't think we're there yet. But it kind of begs the question, could we get there?
He could have. But there would have been, what he would have worried about was that the 2 or 3 or 4 Democrats who opposed using the nuclear option on the filibuster at present might have changed their minds about that if he had become obstructionist for too long on the organizing resolution. So this was a case where Mitch McConnell was trying to raise the issue, maybe crossing his fingers that the Democrats would cave, but realistically, he probably thought that he would not succeed and that he would eventually have to give in. Not organizing the Senate, not passing an organizing resolution means that, well, first of all, you have to understand that the Senate is a continuous body. That is, the Senate never adjourns and disappears and then recreates itself before and after an election. It's always the Senate. Why? Because
I don't mean to butt in here, but it's just like, I know why. I know why. I think I know why.
Only a third of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. Yeah. 2/3 are continuing. In the House, everybody gets elected every 2 years. So that when the House adjourns at the end of a Congress, called adjourning sine die, the House literally disappears and is recreated when they're all sworn into office again in January. And it adopts its whole set of rules anew at the beginning of every Congress. The Senate's rules continue from one Congress to another, including organizing resolutions like who's the chair of a committee and who controls the committee staff. And so the Senate was continuing to operate under the old organizing resolution that put the Republicans in charge of the committees and gave them most of the staff. Roughly about 2/3 of the staff was being run by the Republicans. So the Democrats wanted a new organizing resolution to put their people in the chairmanships and to give them an edge in committee staff, or at least to equalize it. Because they wanted that, Mitch McConnell thought he had some leverage over them.
Yeah.
And could get this concession on the filibuster. Well, the Democrats kind of saw through this. In fact, the whole world, we knew they wouldn't concede on nuking the filibuster. And so it was really kind of up to McConnell about whether or not he dragged this out forever. The risk there would be that people like Joe Manchin from West Virginia or Senator Sinema from Arizona, who are opposed to using the nuclear option, would maybe be persuaded to nuke it, at least for the purposes of an organizing resolution, if they are pushed too far. McConnell knew that. So he knew that if Schumer just held to his position on this, that eventually he'd have to give in. And he chose last night to do it.
Did he win anything? Was there? Do you think there's a long game here that Senator McConnell's playing?
Yeah, there is definitely a long game. First of all, he has to be a little bit anxious about his position. After all, he lost the Senate majority. I should say the Republicans lost their majority while he was leader.
Yeah.
Generally, that's not good for a leader. So I think what he wanted to do is strengthen his bona fides with the conservatives. And conservative activists everywhere were concerned about what would happen to their ability to block the Democrats if the filibuster disappeared. After all, filibuster reform was an issue for the Democrats way back in the presidential primaries. You may recall, Mitch, that people like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden were not filibuster reformers, but the more liberal candidates like Bernie Sanders, said that, if I get elected president, then I'll get blocked by the filibuster. I want to get it reformed. And over the course of the summer, when Biden and Harris were the Democratic candidates, they kind of softened their opposition to filibuster reform and said they would just see how it plays out. If the Republicans become too obstructionist, then maybe we'll give it some thought. That remains their position. But it put Republicans on notice that the new president, if it was Biden, might actually champion filibuster reform if they weren't careful. So they were already very sensitized to this issue before the Georgia election created the Democratic majority, and quite prepared for the possibility that the filibuster would be nuked. So that's when McConnell steps in and says, I hear you. I'm going to at least make a show of trying to protect the filibuster. Here's one step I can take. And he held to that now for basically 3 weeks. He more or less said this at the time of the, about a week before the Georgia elections. He kind of indicated that he'd give the Democrats fits on organizing. And so the result is that he followed through on that. It probably helped shore up his support among conservatives, showed his party colleagues in the Senate that he was willing to fight for them, even though at some point he had to give in if the Democrats were not going to give in, or they might lose the filibuster right here at the start of the Congress. Now it's all going to be put off. You suggested that these issues remain alive. They certainly do. If the Republicans hold up a civil and voting rights bill, if they hold up a COVID relief bill, if they hold up infrastructure, we might find the Democrats back thinking about nuking the filibuster. We'll see. But then that'll turn on what these handful of Democrats like Manchin and Sinema think about the issue. And since they're very much middle of the road, Manchin maybe slightly conservative side of things, they might be hard to get because maybe the filibuster is protecting their bargaining power in the Senate. And we'll just have to see how that plays out. The liberal pressure on Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, to nuke the filibuster is tremendous. It is a powerful lobby. We're going to be seeing campaign-style advertising in the media in favor of this, coalitions of well-funded interest groups mobilizing support for filibuster reform. And so the pressure is going to be immense. So this issue is going to be with us for a minimum of a few weeks until we get to all of these major bills here at the start of the administration.
Former Democratic Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, who will play an important role in the story that we're going to tell back in 2014. But before we get there, says that it's inevitable that the filibuster will be done with sometime in the near future.
Well, he's right. As long as the Senate's politics are more or less like they are now. The Senate politics today are characterized by two major features. One is that the parties are nearly equal in size. Neither party gets to as large as 60 votes very often. In fact, since I think about 1980, neither party has had as many as 60 seats except for one 6-month period. Just after Al Franken his recount was put him in the election into the Senate in July of an odd-numbered year, and so the Democrats had 60 votes. They enacted Obamacare in 2009. Well, they had 60, and then Ted Kennedy died, was replaced by a Republican from Massachusetts, and they were down to 59. That's the only 6-month period with a 60-vote majority in the majority party. So the majority party has been small, and that means that a fairly cohesive minority party can block them. So what's happened in the meantime for party cohesiveness? Well, the parties have been quite polarized, more and more polarized. So a small majority party combined with polarized parties generates almost universal obstructionism in the Senate. And that's the Senate's modern condition. How do they get around it? Well, there's some budget procedures, especially the one called reconciliation. Reconciliation bills are bills that are debated without a filibuster because there's a debate limit. You know that there's finally going to be a vote on the measure. The result is that when you're in the majority party, Republican or Democrat, you try to stuff as much legislation into reconciliation as possible. But the Senate has certain rules about what can be in a reconciliation bill, and that's getting a lot of discussion right now on Capitol Hill.
Let me ask a follow-up question about that, because people may be confused of the talk about filibuster, eliminating filibuster, and then budget reconciliation. And these are separate paths. These are separate procedural paths. I think it's important to understand. And budget reconciliation is being talked about with this proposed Economic Recovery Act, what Joe Biden's proposing at $1.9 trillion. Joe Biden doesn't introduce legislation, so it'll have to be actually a lawmaker who does it, just to be clear. But because it can be, I guess, classified as a budget bill, that gives them the ability to bypass a filibuster, which is different from eliminating the filibuster on, say, some other legislation like immigration or something.
That's right. For very limited types of legislation, the Senate does not allow a filibuster. It does that by setting a debate limit. Budget legislation, of course, is extremely important. In the 1970s, Congress adopted a budget process that allowed it to enact comprehensive budgets covering all of the affairs of the federal government virtually. These bills, there's two kinds: a budget resolution, which authorizes a second kind, which is called a reconciliation bill. These bills were deemed to be so important to the role of Congress in our constitutional system that the Senate agreed to debate limits for those bills. Over the ensuing Congresses, members of Congress tried to stick in to reconciliation bills as much legislation as they could, because they knew if they could get that provision into a reconciliation bill, it couldn't be filibustered. In the 1990s, congressional Republicans in the majority, after the 1994 elections, decided that this would be a good way to pass tax cuts. And eventually, in 2001 and 2002, in the early Bush administration years, they passed major tax cuts as reconciliation bills so that they could not be filibustered in the Senate.
So 2017 was not the first time they did that.
That's right. So since that time, most tax bills, major tax bills have been, well, from the very start, been thought to be treated as reconciliation bills so that they could not be filibustered. Now, in 2009, Obamacare was passed through the Senate as a reconciliation bill, and it could not be filibustered. Let me back up half a step. The initial bill was passed as a regular bill with 60 votes that they had during that period, thanks to Al Franken. But they passed that Obamacare bill on Christmas Eve of 2009.
Yes.
Ted Kennedy then died. And in January, when they needed to work out the differences with the House, they no longer had 60 votes in the Senate. So they needed a legislative vehicle for working out the House-Senate differences. And they created a reconciliation bill for that purpose. So they're back to it now. They're thinking, now what new creative ways can we use this process to enact COVID relief, to enact infrastructure, to enact a minimum wage? And the responsibility for devising that bill goes to the Budget Committee chairs. And in the Senate, the Budget Committee chair will soon be Bernie Sanders, who's working closely with the party leader, Chuck Schumer, to get as much of their program included in the reconciliation bills as they can. Now, the challenge is the Senate also has a rule. It's called the Byrd Rule. It's not B-I-R-D, it's B-Y-R-D, after Robert Byrd, this long-term senator from West Virginia. And the Byrd Rule says that only matters related to budgets, that is, affecting revenues or affecting spending by the federal government, can be included in a budget bill, a reconciliation bill. And one of the challenges is if some things have only marginal budget effects, technically they're out of order, cannot be included.
Who rules on that?
That's the way they thought about the minimum wage.
Yeah.
And so now they're trying to tuck the minimum wage into reconciliation so that they can avoid a filibuster in the Senate.
Who rules whether or not it counts?
The presiding officer. The presiding officer is, of course, is either the vice president, the president pro tem in the absence of the vice president, or some other senator who's the acting vice president when the president pro tem isn't there. Now, if you were looking at the Senate on C-SPAN, down below the presiding officer, you're going to see someone whose back is almost always turned to the camera and looking up at the presiding officer. That's the parliamentarian. The parliamentarian advises the presiding officer and is kind of the authority on all procedural matters, including the meaning of the Byrd Rule. However, and I should say that presiding officers 99.999% of the time follow the advice of the parliamentarian. Senators generally want some order to their proceedings. And of course, much of this advice really has no partisan implication. It's just, how does the Senate proceed on something? So, last night when the House managers on impeachment came to the Senate, that's a rare event, and the presiding officer doesn't know all the technical language to use to make sure that happens properly. So the parliamentarian passes the presiding officer a piece of paper to read to make sure that everything is done properly. Or if there's a question raised, like a point of order made from a senator on the floor, the parliamentarian will advise the presiding officer. Most of this can be anticipated. You kind of know what the strategies are. And so the parliamentarian comes with advice prepared. But the presiding officer doesn't have to follow that advice. They almost always do. However, it's important to note that a presiding officer's ruling can be appealed to the full Senate. A senator rises and say, I appeal the ruling of the chair. And then there's a majority vote to accept or overturn the ruling of the chair. So this could end up in the hands of the Senate or the presiding officer. So there's several ways in which they can squeeze in, say, a minimum wage into a reconciliation bill and avoid a filibuster. One, they can write the reconciliation bill so that that provision has clear spending or revenue effects. That's probably what they're debating right now. How might they do that? Well, a former senior staffer in the Senate published an op-ed just the other day suggesting, well, let's tie it to small business tax breaks, that the minimum wage is increased to $15 only if small businesses get a tax break, an additional tax break. The idea there may be that small businesses have trouble affording a hike in the minimum wage, so let's give them a tax break to compensate. Say that the minimum wage hike does not go into effect for them unless there's a tax break. The tax break clearly has revenue effects, so therefore the minimum wage must have a revenue effect. So there's a little bit of creativity and legislative draftsmanship that might be involved. So that would be used to persuade the parliamentarian to recommend that if there's a point of order, that this actually is kosher and it's just fine to have that in the reconciliation bill and avoid a filibuster. Or the presiding officer might get the opposite advice from the parliamentarian. No, it violates the Byrd Rule, doesn't deal enough with spending and After all, the minimum wage is paid by the private sector. It's not paid primarily by the federal government. There are no federal spending and tax implications. They're minimal. So recommends against it. Presiding officer can say, well, I think you're wrong, and rule otherwise. Or they could turn it over to the Senate. So I'm guessing, just a guess, that the minimum wage is going to make its way through the Senate as part of reconciliation. But it's an important alternative. It shows that the Senate, which historically has been dedicated to the idea that a minority should be able to slow things down, maybe even block things if they care enough, has been willing, the Senate's been willing to accept limits on debate and circumvent filibusters, at least on some issues. Basically, all budget matters, all tax matters, and a bunch of other things, even something like healthcare reform. So it's gotten to the point in the Senate where it's almost arbitrary, almost a function of historical accident, that some things are subject to a filibuster and some things are not. And that's what's making those who don't like filibusters, liberal Democrats at the moment, very frustrated that the Republicans might be able to block some of their favorite legislation.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with Stephen S. Smith, who is a professor of social sciences and political science at Washington University. He's the other author of such books as Politics Over Process and The Senate Syndrome. We are talking about rules and procedures of how Congress operates. I was a congressional reporter between 2003 and 2006. And
I figured you knew more about Congress than you were fessing up to. Man.
Well, I meant to ask this earlier. I meant to go here earlier. How was it?
No one talks about reconciliation. So
wait until I get to conference committees. After spending a little time with actually reading the introduction of both of the books that I mentioned in your title last night, it kind of became clear to me that when I was on the Hill between 2003 and 2006, that I was witnessing an end of an era. And intuitively, I knew that. But going through your books, it really made me think that concretely there are observable traits that show how different Congress operates today than it did 15 years ago. It's not just the tenor of language and rhetoric, it's also in procedures and rules.
That's right. Members of Congress and outsiders who follow it closely sometimes refer to the regular order. And the regular order has virtually disappeared. By regular order, we mean what most people in the United States understand to be how Congress makes a law. Legislator introduces it, it goes to a committee, it's amended there, it's sent to the floor, debated, amended. The other house does the same thing. It comes up with a slightly different version. The two houses create a conference committee to work out a compromise between the House and Senate versions. And then the two chambers approve the compromise. That kind of orderly, step-by-step, committee-oriented process with the conference initial committee consideration, then a conference committee to debate, to work out the differences, where the conference committee is composed of members of the committees of origin, was the old standard process. That very seldom is the process by which Congress does its work today. Very seldom. And those two books deal with two important features of the destruction of that old system. Now, it's important to realize that the Constitution allows Congress to go about making legislation in any way it sees fit. The Constitution doesn't dictate that regular order. Yeah. Congress has made that up. But they lived with it for decades and decades, and certainly had become customary. But they've set aside custom. And we now live in an era of, sometimes it's called unorthodox legislating, where each bill is treated kind of differently. The process is adjusted to meet the political circumstances of the majority parties. One of those circumstances is the filibuster. This process worked most of the time because most bills were not blocked on the Senate floor by a filibustering minority. Filibusters were rare, far rarer than we could have had filibusters in every bill, but most members just didn't bother with it. But over the course of the period since the 1970s, last half century, step by step, very gradually at first, more and more legislation has been subject to a filibuster. And eventually, filibustering in the 90s was extended to some nominations for executive posts and judicial positions. But after the turn of the 20th century, the ratcheting up of obstructionism was really quite amazing. It occurred by both Republican and Democratic minorities, to the point where when Mitch McConnell found himself as minority leader in 2007 and 2008, he referred to the Senate as the 60-vote Senate. It had been so commonplace to filibuster that it was taking 60 votes, that is to overcome a filibuster, on virtually every major bill. And it became almost a norm, when in fact, it wasn't the norm at all a generation earlier. Something happened to our politics. And those two things I mentioned at the outset, the polarization of the two parties, so that the opposition party, the minority party, was less willing to accept majority party success, less happy with the outcome, less willing to compromise. And the fact that the two parties were of nearly equal size meant that you can never be sure whether you were going to be in the majority or the minority after the next election, meant that you had to get it now.
Yeah.
And it intensified partisan competition. It intensified the teamsmanship of party politics. You wanted your side to look good and you wanted the other side to look bad because it could determine the outcome of the next election, determine whether or not you're in the majority. Back when the Democrats had large majorities, well, that really wasn't an issue. You knew they were going to be in the majority after the next election. So Republicans who wanted to have some part in policymaking would work with the Republicans.
They went along.
And the Democrats didn't have a lot on the line. They could work with the other side too. But the intense inter-party competition for control of Congress, combined with the polarization, has had this effect of upsetting the whole process. The other book had to do with the demise of conference committees. The problem with conference committees is that when a conference committee meets and works out a compromise, the resulting conference report has to be approved by the House and Senate. In the House, where there's no filibusters, that's generally not a problem. But in the Senate, that conference report could be filibustered. So you go to all the trouble of having a conference meet, work out, maybe taking weeks to work out all the details, and then send it back to the Senate only to have it blocked by a minority. So you can imagine the majority starts thinking, what's the point of having a conference committee? Let's circumvent the whole process. Let's work out House-Senate differences in a closed-door meeting, involve only the majority party, work out our differences, and then write a brand new bill, considered in the House and the Senate in identical form. If we can get them to pass it, just that one bill, then we don't have to have a conference committee at all, because they both passed the bill in the same form. So conference committees have virtually disappeared.
I've noticed that. And I did witness conference committees when I was a congressional correspondent in the previous decade. And I mean, there's a real takeaway here. And again, a conference committee is this committee that's made up by both senators and House members, and their job after the Senate and the House approve their own versions of a similar bill but have differences. Their job is to create one single bill, because you can only send one bill to the president's desk for either a signature or a veto. It was part of the democratic process. But instead, what we see now, rather than this kind of back and forward and negotiations, and it had an involvement of many members of Congress, because these conference committees could be pretty big, if I recall correctly, you have instead is negotiations between the leadership. that the leadership
That's right.
of both parties and both chambers are the ones who are now doing all of the negotiations behind closed doors, and coming up with some kind of deal that they think they can get through Congress. I mean, this almost is even part of the process of making some committee work. Generally, not just the conference committee, but generally, you used to think a bill would be introduced by a senator, go to the appropriate committee, be amended, debated, worked on, then go to the floor, then be voted on, and then go through the whole process in the other chamber. Even that's rare today.
Well, that's right. Two observations about that. One is the value of being on a committee for many members of Congress was to get to a conference committee, because that's where final decisions were generally made. If you wanted to be in on the writing of the final version of the bill, you wanted to get to the conference committee, and you got there by being on the committee that originated the bill in your House. And so when the conference committees disappear, much of the value of dedicating yourself to committee work is reduced. And committees become just places for hearings and showcases, but not real work on legislation. And that's unfortunate for the average member. What happens instead is that when leaders are working on differences between the two houses, they call in committee members very selectively. The majority leadership calls in only majority party members, and it's usually just a handful of senior members, and the rank and file members of committee just really aren't too engaged at that process. If you do that year after year, and that's what's happened in Congress in the last 2 decades, if you do that year after year, you say, why do we even go through committee at all? Let's just make all these negotiations through the majority party and get this all done in one big, massive bill at the end of a Congress. So what happened in the last Congress? None of the 12 regular spending bills, appropriations bills, were even considered on the Senate floor. They were all taken up in an omnibus appropriations bill covering all of the agencies of the federal government, not broken up into 12 parts like usual, debated on the Defense Department and then education and then intelligence and so on. Instead, they were all packaged in one massive bill that really only a handful of members, a few committee members and the party leadership on the majority side had a hand in devising and modifying at the last stages of the process. So it's changed a lot, and it's created a great deal of dissatisfaction with serving in Congress. You go there wanting to contribute, and then you find yourself closed out of the rooms where decisions are made.
Talk to me about the history of the filibuster. This is interesting, and there's no actual filibuster rule. It's actually absent of a filibuster rule, I believe. I think it's just that a senator could take to the floor and hold the floor for as long as he or she wants, and then you need a supermajority to break that. And it's become more procedural over time. But interestingly, there's nothing in the Constitution about the filibuster in the Senate, and you, along with others, have signed on to this letter to senators pointing out that the framers who were involved in the Constitutional Convention also had no sense of there being a filibuster that would be used in the Senate.
Well, when the Constitution was written, they didn't even include a provision to indicate how many votes it was required to pass a bill. They simply assumed it was going to be a simple majority. But you don't find a provision in the Constitution saying a simple majority must approve the bill in identical form in the House and the Senate. They're just silent on it because they assumed simple majority rule.
It was obvious.
So what happened? Well, the House, about a quarter century after the Constitution was ratified, decided it needed a rule to limit debate. If you know Robert's Rules of Order, you know it was called the motion on the previous question, right? And in fact, Robert's Rules of Order was modeled after the House rules when it was written in the decades following the Civil War. In the Senate, they never adopted such a similar rule. So you're right. The ability to filibuster is due to the absence of a rule that limits debate. That was the case in the Senate all the way until 1917, when the famous Senate rule, Rule 22, was adopted that allowed a supermajority, at that time a 2/3 majority, to close debate and force a vote. Over the course of the 19th century, especially as slavery became an issue in the decades before the Civil War, this lack of a rule to limit debate came to be exploited by people like John C. Calhoun of South Carolina and other Southerners to prevent the Senate from acting on limitations on slavery that had been approved by the House. And so from the beginning, the practice of filibustering was very closely associated with the issue of race and slavery. After the Civil War, slavery, of course, was eradicated, but civil rights and voting rights were a keen issue. After Reconstruction, of course, the South began to adopt Jim Crow laws that Northern liberals wanted to challenge with federal legislation. That became subject to filibustering too. One of the most famous filibusters was in 1890-91, when a bill that the North called the election bill and the South called the force bill would have authorized the use of federal authority to enforce voting rights in the South. It was filibustered to death and never passed. As a result, for decades, no civil rights legislation was considered in Congress. It was an absolute disaster to our history of race relations and enforcing civil and voting rights, especially at that time in the South. Filibuster was ultimately used to block federal legislation to prevent lynching in the South, which became a serious problem in the early decades of the 20th century. In 1917, on a completely different issue, we finally got Rule 22, which set a 2/3 majority for closing debate. And the issue there was somewhat of a surprise. The Germans' U-boats, their submarines, were sinking the merchant marine ships crossing the Atlantic at the start of World War I, before we got into the war. And President Wilson wanted federal legislation that would authorize those merchant ships to arm themselves against the German U-boats. This was filibustered and killed by some members of Congress, largely from the Mountain West.
Fighting Bob La Follette, who's the founder of the Progressive magazine.
Who thought that arming the ships against the Germans would drag the United States into the war. Well, it was so unpopular that bill was killed. You can imagine Americans wanted the merchant ships to defend themselves, as President Wilson was advocating. The Senate was kind of forced by public opinion to adopt a rule to limit debate. But they couldn't get enough senators to agree to a simple majority vote to limit debate. They got a 2/3 vote. And that 2/3 vote continued to be applied to all legislation until 1975, when it was reduced to 3/5. The 2/3 requirement then and still applies to changes in the rules. So if you were to introduce a resolution and have it debated on the Senate floor to change the Senate rules, like with respect to the filibuster, it would require a 2/3 majority to close the debate on that matter. That's an impossible hurdle for a majority that's not nearly 2/3 of the Senate. And that's why the nuclear option of doing it, forcing it through a point of order on the Senate floor, is the alternative that's been used here in the last 2 decades. And what makes the use of this approach to effectively changing the Senate's rules so important and unique. It means that a Senate majority can ignore the plain meaning of the written rule and impose any understanding it wants on the Senate by a simple majority, by simply ignoring the rule and saying, this is our new understanding. That's calling going nuclear, because it's ignoring the Senate's rules and doing it by kind of brute force.
And at some time, it'll affect both sides.
Yes, keep in mind, right now, we have a standing rule in the Senate that says it takes a 3/5 majority to close debate on a nomination. But the Senate's understanding, thanks to this point of order that was adopted in 2013 and again in 2017, is that now a simple majority can do it, even though the rule on the books still says it takes a 3/5 or a 60 vote majority. And so the question here is, will they extend this nuking of the filibuster to all legislation or certain kinds of additional legislation? That's the issue before the Senate this month.
Mitch McConnell's interesting to me because I remember him back when I was again on the Hill. This is between 2003, 2006. He's part of the Senate Republican leadership, but he is not the leader. That is now the forgotten Bill Frist, who was the Senate Majority Leader when I was there, who I don't think anyone really remembers anymore. And I remember Mitch McConnell being in the background. And I remember I used to think, what's this guy all about? And I had no sense at the time that he would become sort of this figure that he has become. And just thinking about Mitch McConnell makes me think that this may be the most, and please disagree with me if you do, but Mitch McConnell may be the most consequential Senate leader since Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 1950s.
Well, when we're talking about how much influence or how consequential a legislator is, it gets to be kind of a tricky question. Keep in mind that someone like Lyndon Johnson was an extremely powerful, influential leader. His problem was that he had a party that was divided right down the middle between conservatives and liberals. And so he was very effective in keeping them kind of a functioning, working party that took extraordinary skill and influence, personal influence with his colleagues. Mitch McConnell is not working in that environment. He's working in an environment where he has only one or two or three of his colleagues. We can think of Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, and maybe from time to time Mitt Romney from Utah, who go off on their own. But otherwise, he's got a very, very cohesive party behind him. And for the most part, he's doing what that majority wants. So he's not directing his party. He's actually he's not the engine. He's merely at the steering wheel. So it's hard to compare leaders and their influence in very different eras. So I'd be a little bit careful there. But it does look like he is free to exercise quick judgment on party strategy in a way that most other party leaders have not. For example, when Justice Scalia passed away by surprise, within an hour or two, the Senate was not in session, and McConnell I think he was down south vacationing. Within an hour or two, came out and said that they would not be considering Obama's nominee to replace Scalia. And he had done this without a meeting of fellow Republicans. But because his party's so cohesive, he could correctly evaluate what they would want him to do and say. And so he went out to do that. So does that make him consequential? Well, it certainly means that he articulates a party strategy, and it looks like he's doing it on his own, but he's doing it with the knowledge and years of experience coming to know what his party expects. And so I think we should think of Mitch McConnell as essentially the equivalent of his party, and it's very difficult to separate them.
Stephen S. Smith has been our guest. Stephen Smith is a professor of social sciences and political science at Washington University. He is the author of such books as Politics Over Prose and The Senate Syndrome. He has joined us to talk about the current procedural hurdles in Congress and their history. Professor Smith, I've enjoyed our conversation very much. As I said in my email, helping set up this conversation, I actually love these kind of conversations, and I wasn't kidding. So thank you, sir.
I can't imagine how rare it is for someone so enmeshed in congressional procedure as me to get an opportunity to talk about it outside of the PhD classroom.
Thank you again.
My pleasure.